Now, in our third session, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paulo Santiago. Dr. Paulo is the head of the Policy Advice and Implementation Division at the OECD, and his presentation is titled Using Evaluation and Assessment Data to Strengthen the Evidence for Policy Development and Promote Informed Dialogue in Education. So Dr. Paulo is the head of the Policy Advice and Implementation Division within OECD, Directorate for Education and Skills. He takes a leading role in the provision of evidence-based advice on education policy to OECD members and partner countries, both collectively and individually across all sectors of education. Mr. Santiago joined the OECD in 2000 as an analyst. He assumed responsibility for a number of large-scale cross-country reviews covering a range of education policy areas, including teacher policy, tertiary education policy, educational evaluation and assessment, use of resources in school education, and school funding. This work generated OECD policy lines, analytical frameworks, developmental work for future data collections, as well as much information about country practices. He also led reviews of teacher policy, tertiary education policy, educational evaluation policy, and school resource use in over 25 countries. Mr. Santiago holds a PhD in economics from Northwestern University, United States. Dr. Santiago.
Many thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today and to bring to this discussion the extensive OECD work on evaluation and assessment. And let me also congratulate you for bringing this topic for discussion. I think it's the reflection of the many developments in Saudi Arabia on evaluation and assessment in general, and also in education in particular, through in particular the work of ETEC, with which we have the pleasure to collaborate, including in the organization of this conference. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Today I'll be basing my presentation on the work on policy that we've done in this area, and I'll focus in particular on the uses of student assessment data at all levels of education with the objective of improving student learning outcomes. So let me give you a very quickly first an overview of my presentation. First of all, I will situate the presentation in the overall evaluation and assessment framework, which is quite extensive in education. Then I'll focus and mention in particular what type of uses student assessment data can have in order to improve, what are the different channels to improve student learning outcomes. And then I will basically go one by one through each of these channels to basically get into more detail on how to basically implement this. So first, let me first give you an overview and to situate this presentation in the overall evaluation and assessment framework. So we've done an extensive piece of work, and we continue actually to build on it, on evaluation and assessment policies in about 30 OECD countries. And the final comparative report is called Synergies for Better Learning. And we basically had an holistic approach to evaluation and assessment by reviewing all elements of evaluation and assessment in the education system, not only system evaluation, but also at student, teacher, school level, and also school leader level. And at each level, the results of evaluation and assessment, including assessment data, can be used with three main functions: accountability, for development, for improvement of practices, and also diagnostic in order to improve those practices. And at different levels, at student, teacher, school, education system level, each of these functions basically have different translations in terms of what they mean. For instance, at the school level, it's about the improvement function, it's about school development and how to develop the school. And also the accountability aspect is more related to the rewards and potential sanctions that the school might have as a result of the evaluation. So we've looked at all these uses and the interconnections between them, take into account, for instance, that a tool such as student assessment data can actually be used at the different levels. So they all interlink, and this is why it's important to have an holistic approach to evaluation and assessment. Within this framework, then we have the specific use of student assessment data. And I'm more focusing actually on standardized assessment data, which can be used at different levels of the framework and with three major channels in terms of how it can lead to better student learning outcomes. So the first channel, and I will present each one of them in more detail. The first channel is essentially the sharing of the data for public information. So it's a means in particular to generate accountability at the system level and also to promote school choice, for instance. A second aspect is actually use the data and student assessment data to build evidence for policy planning and development. And then a third aspect is improvement of practices at the different levels. So I will now elaborate on each one of the three of them. Of course, the big question is the use of data. I mean, countries are more and more facing the dilemma of generating quite a lot of data, but then not being able to actually use it, analyze it in order to improve student learning outcomes. So the objective is really how to best use the data, take into account that more and more the systems are generating great amounts of data. So a first major channel through which student assessment data can be used to improve student learning outcomes is actually involves the whole management of the data and how to share it. So a first step is actually to design the evidence base. So a reflection about what are the type of data that you need to inform your policy development, to make sure that the public in general can have scrutiny over the system. So for this, you actually need a deep reflection on the type of data you need to actually capture the whole range of student learning objectives, making sure that you're covering all the objectives and that you're actually monitoring all of these. This involves a number of things, a number of instruments in particular. You need to actually develop an education indicators framework to reflect about what type of indicators you need to monitor your education system. Things such as simply the level of funding every year in a country, how you distribute that funding across different levels of education, what are the rates, the graduation rates of your system, a range of indicators about the performance of the system at the system level. Then you also need to monitor in particular the main area, which are student learning outcomes. You need a strategy to monitor those student learning standards. So typically countries use national assessments, which can be in full cohort or based on samples. Then they also use, of course, international surveys for international benchmarking, but they need to go also beyond the quantitative and collect a range of qualitative information, such as, for instance, overviews of evaluations of schools performed by the agency performing school evaluation. It can include key stakeholder surveys, for instance, asking parents about the state of education in the country. And the third element is the need to actually have basic demographic information about students and schools to be able to relate these to the outcomes themselves. Another instrument that is useful is to follow in a longitudinal way a particular student cohorts, because it gives you very specific information. Then you need to actually reflect about how to manage this knowledge and the data you created, and create it in a way that makes it efficient for the users. So this involves the establishment of protocols to harmonize, define the indicators, for instance, making sure that you have data information and management systems that are used and targeted at different users, making sure there's methodological documentation, and then you have a reflection about how to make the information public, or at least part of it. And many countries have basically developed school web portals and annual state of education types of reports, statistical reports. So there's a range of ways to make sure that the general public and different stakeholders in particular have access to this information. One particular example, one of the things you can do to actually hold schools accountable is to take the results of student assessment, standardized assessment across the country, and publish it. So it's a dilemma in terms of policy, whether countries should publish this at the school level or not. And many countries don't do it, many others do it because there's actually pros and cons. Of course, the public reporting of student data at the school level creates incentives for better performance. It might provide opportunities for recognition and rewards, and it provides information for parents and society, in particular for public school choice for parents. However, it can have a range of detrimental effects as demonstrated in the literature. First of all, raw student assessment data reflects more than school impact. The results, the average results of assessments reflect more than school impact, and it can distort because there's different other influences, particular socioeconomic backgrounds of students, and therefore they can actually also influence the results. So the raw results of student assessment data do not fully capture the actual school impact. Then the student assessment data also does not cover the full spectrum of outcomes of the school. The gaming, then there might potentially be gaming if there's stakes for the institutions, as when the results are provided publicly, so that the agents, in particular teachers and the school leaders, focus then on what is measured and engage in practices such teaching to the test and narrowing the curriculum to all those areas that are tested. And then there might also be effects on hindering innovation in the school. So there are detrimental effects. So what shall we do? Essentially, you need to make sure if the country decides to publish, it needs to make sure that the measure is actually a good account of the impact of the school itself. And we do this by developing what we call value-added performance measures, where you pick up and identify what is the actual impact of the school on student learning outcomes. And then you also make sure that you reduce the potential detrimental effects. And you do this by trying to actually diversify the type of data you published and to also publish alongside it qualitative type information, such as the one that comes from the school evaluation reports. Then a second aspect, a second major channel is through the policy development, making sure that the data informs evidence, and if that evidence informs the development of the policies. So first of all, the first step is to make sure that you have a strategic approach to research. This involves creating actually education research institutes such as in Korea, but it can also be research units within evaluation agencies or education administration, knowledge units to basically review the evidence in the literature, identify research gaps, commission papers from researchers, etc. Then the second step is to make sure that you actually involve the research community in the debates. That can be done through advisory groups, involve the researchers in the reforms themselves. That exchange with researchers can also be done at the school level, for instance, with the use of critical friends in schools in terms of using the evidence. A specialized evaluation agency, typically with technical leadership in the field, can also lead this process of developing evidence and also engage in actually considerations about the state of education in the country in order to actually inform policy development. A third aspect is then once you have your evidence and you developed your analysis, that you make sure that you use it to develop the policies. It can also be done through policy experimentation and pilots. And of course, very important, in order to develop consensus building among stakeholders and promote informed dialogue, you also need to disseminate this evidence so that the stakeholders themselves can use it, so that they can understand the rationale of reforms, and you can engage them in the dialogue. This also is valid for the level of practitioners with their involvement with the implementation of policies and their evaluation. Finally, a final channel through which student assessment data can have an impact is through the practices themselves. So it's much more localized in terms of channel. So you can actually take your infrastructure of indicators and data and develop in such a way that it's useful at the different levels. For instance, for education authorities to have benchmarking analysis about the schools within a given local authority and compare it to other local authorities. Similarly, at the school level, you can prepare reports with your student assessment data at the school level with good benchmarking to other comparable schools, and schools can use that to actually develop their own school development plans. At the same time, at the teachers level, similarly, the information can be used at the class level, the student outcomes in standardized tests, as good diagnostic evidence. In this case, you need to be timely and provide quick feedback from those student assessment standardized tests so that you can actually use them quickly to improve the practices. Finally, an important reporting aspect is the reporting to parents. If you prepare the information properly in a way that is useful, meaning going beyond the marks, but actually getting to details of the strengths and areas of concern, the identified learning needs of students and recommendations for further learning, if you have that in the reporting to parents individually per student, this is a very good way of actually involving the parents in their children's learning and have them as basically partners of the learning itself. So this is, in a nutshell, very quickly, 3 major channels through which student assessment data can actually influence student outcomes, through policy development, through improvement of practices at local level, and through also the sharing of information more widely. So thank you very much for your attention, and I leave you with a few interesting links, including the last one, which is our own knowledge management and platform with all the work and results of education work at the OECD. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Paulo. You mentioned in your presentation the importance of information management systems, which this is leads me to a question: how digital education mainly changed things and perspectives in terms of education evaluation and strategic targets of education policymakers. And if you can focus on probably two things. The first is the supply and outcomes of education systems, and the second one is the demand shifts within the labor market, which is happening now more frequently.
I mean, there's essentially 2 aspects to your question. The first I understand is how to use the digital technology itself, meaning the skills you acquire through digital education, and what are the implications for assessment. I mean, for the assessment, it brings many benefits in terms of the accuracy of the assessment. For instance, ICT-based assessment allows you to go into a lot more detail in terms of the learning of the students through adaptive assessment, for instance. This is when the assessment itself and the next question depends on the previous responses. It can also improve the timeliness of the feedback, meaning the results become available much more quickly and the teacher can use it much more quickly. It also increases the analytical power of the data in terms of our ability to analyze it, in terms of processing the data, including big data, for instance, and also the availability in terms of the digital platforms that it can generate. The second aspect of the question is more about the digital education skills themselves, which are becoming more prominent in the different education systems. It's important that they become an important part of the curriculum and that they're actually cross-curricular aspects related to digital education in every aspect of education. And this essentially implies developing, of course, targets for the learning of those skills and also develop assessment tools also to measure those, including in terms of and this also has implications for the supply of programs, of course, not only at the school level, but also higher education level, and including because as a result of the demand of labor markets that you mentioned. And this brings, for instance, to prominence the importance of informing students and using actually assessment and the use of platforms to inform career guidance through basically platforms about labor market outcomes, for instance, so that they are informed to choose their careers at the university.
Sure. Another point I want to ask Dr. Paulo is, as we all know, there's an explosion of data happening worldwide. So from your experience, how does this steer the current understanding of our education systems and maybe baselining the performance of those systems. And if you can give a few examples on how this helped different countries or organizations in developing their education policies or enhancing them or enhancing the outcome of those policies.
I mean, the fact that there's much greater availability of data has clearly led to one major development, which is the fact that the policy development itself can be much more evidence-based. But this also led to the lead of development capacity to analyze those data. And this includes actually the creation of agencies devoted to the use of data, to evaluation. And we've seen that in many countries, the creation of agencies that focus on evaluation and assessment in education. At the same time, that evidence leads clearly to a much more informed policy dialogue, which didn't exist without that evidence. And this supports, I mean, the governments in terms of building the rationale for their reforms, but also the arguments in how they actually discuss with the stakeholders. At the same time, it has really raised considerably the possibilities in terms of comparing, including comparing across countries. And you've seen the development in terms of international benchmarking that has the benefit to basically put a lot more attention, will bring a lot more attention to education reforms and basically improving the attention to education and leading to reforms. Another major development, of course, has been our ability to measure student learning outcomes themselves, and this has considerably improved in the last few years, brings the attention to the focal point of the analysis becomes the student learning outcomes, which is really the key thing we need to analyze. So the discussion turns around what really matters, and at the same time has allowed much more accountability to be introduced in the systems, and therefore has changed the shape and the type of discussion that exists. At the same time, we need to be careful with one particular development, which is the fact that we're developing a lot of data, focusing very much on measurement and development of indicators, also brings risks, and brings risks in terms of simplifying too much the development of policy, or at least simplified uses of those data by looking at correlations and simple indicators and rankings. So we need to make sure that all this measurement that certainly policy is informed by quality data, but is not driven by their availability. There are many aspects that cannot be measured. So it's very important to engage in qualitative type of analysis, the secondary analysis of the data, and develop also narratives in terms of the processes at schools to complement this. So we need a broader approach to basically have a full picture of education systems in the world these days.
Very well said, Dr. Paulo. Thank you so much.